what's the definition of capitalism? Well, it's the ism of capital, meaning the ideology of capital, right? And that the purpose of capital is more capital. That's the purpose of the economy. It's you make an investment, you get more money in return. That's the whole orienting principle. That's a pretty simple definition. So post-capitalism would be things where it's not engaged in capital supremacy. It's not saying that the purpose of money is more money. Purpose of money might be shared societal outcomes. It could be more well-being, more economic democracy, more ecological value, more civic participation, right? That's where a lot of these different terms come from. There's buen vivir, solidarity, well-being. They're trying to point to a different kind of teleological direction to the purpose of an economy.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Evan Steiner from One Project. In this conversation, we go into Evan's background, his explorations into what's at the root of the ecological crisis. We talk about what is One Project and the post-capitalist grant portfolio it's constructed. We discuss the economic and political paradigms that are leading to the polycrisis and consider how do we collectively respond. Evan shares about the standout projects and organizations that he's seen and reflects on the philanthropic space more broadly. Evan is really thoughtful. He's able to connect a lot of different threads together and draw important distinctions. This conversation was recorded at the Eco Weaving Gathering in Wilbur, April 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Evan Steiner. We are here today with Evan Steiner. Evan focuses on resource mobilization at One Project. Thanks for being here, Evan.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe to start, let's give a little bit of a summary of what is One Project.
Yeah, first let me say, it's nice to be here with you. I love you very much, Matthew. Thanks so much for it's really fun to be in conversation with you. One Project, it's an organization, it's a nonprofit. It's focused on specifically post-capitalist economics, so we're exploring economic alternatives that are exploring visions beyond capitalism. I can tell you more about that. We have a few different programs that we focus to enact those visions. A lot of it focuses on socioeconomic alternatives. There's a lot around movement building and power building, narrative work, and then also supporting the broader ecosystem through funding, grant making, and investments.
And how did you come into this line of work?
Circuitously.
I wanted to be a firefighter, an oceanographer, or work on post-capitalist economics.
Yeah, I was very fortunate that I was always able to just explore what I was interested in. I was able to kind of follow the breadcrumbs. And early in my career, I started teaching environmental education in college. I got a kind of side gig taking people into nature and teaching them rock climbing and vertical caving and kayaking and all these things like that. And then after college, I got into environmental education. That's what I did. And then through that learned about the climate and ecological crisis and things like that. And so my inquiry has always been what's at the roots of the ecological crisis and what's causing that structurally, and not just the climate crisis, but the ecological crisis more broadly. And earlier in my career, my thinking was, okay, well, it's businesses and corporations, they're causing so much of the issues. So I went and worked in the business for good space, the social enterprise, impact investment world, and was there for a few years and saw a lot of great work and wonderful people, but that it still wasn't quite getting at some of the structural issues that I was interested to explore. And so started getting into new economics and really looking at the ecological crisis as emerging out of, or even kind of an epiphenomena of a poorly structured economic system. And so started into that space, started an organization called Whole Person Economy, which is really looking at whole person development and saying that the purpose of an economy, when it's well structured, should be enabling the flourishing of the individual within society and within the ecology. And so kind of a spiritual lens into economics and exploring ethics and values. And another thing that I saw when I started in the new economic space was that you have all this money going into propping up neoliberal capitalism, just billions and trillions of dollars going to think tanks and academic organizations. And there's so much infrastructure set up for all this, where the more holistic interpretations, the ecological economics, the well-being economics, solidarity economy, all of these different terms, keep going, post-growth, degrowth, economic democracy. There's very little funding, very little support, and little resources for that. And we could talk about why that's the case. It's interesting, but just to say, I saw that and I became really interested in, okay, well, how do you drive more resources to build capacities and build those kinds of institutions? And was very fortunate to, as I was hosting events and convenings kind of in the new economy space, come across one project as it was just getting going. And so I was came into there initially helping build out some of the research capacity and then expanding into the grant making and investments. And then now, as you mentioned, focusing on resource mobilization more broadly, which is exploring things around innovative finance and new economic asset classes and different ways to move financial and non-financial resources to communities and frontline groups and grassroots, and really about how do you push money power to those most impacted.
And one project being a philanthropic grant-making institution, as well as an operating nonprofit founded by Justin Rosenstein, the endowment enabled, I guess, by Asana and his work in the technology space.
Yeah, so the founder, Justin Rosenstein, is a really wonderful visionary in a lot of different ways and has been on his path and his evolution. And, I don't, I'm reticent to share his story, but I guess from my perspective, very succinctly, he was on teams at Facebook and Google and a lot of products built that a lot of people use. And he saw how some of the economics and the incentives underneath the technology would cause a lot of the, really well-intentioned initiatives to kind of go in a different direction, most notably like the like button and, this kind of really positive intention of how are you spreading more love and positivity in the world. But the business model and the incentive structure is just taking that into getting people addicted to their phones and all of these, obvious things that have emerged from that. And so he became more interested in these kind of what are the deeper structural economic system components that are causing these different issues. And when he was stepping into his philanthropy, and he then, after he started company Asana, which is very focused on collaboration, which is also another very important key theme. How do groups and communities work together more effectively? And so as he was stepping into his philanthropy, also came in from that kind of economics and governance layer. And and stepping more into that role more and more over time, and then hopefully working with more and more other funders. There's still a very under-resourced.
Totally.
Like there's basically no funding in this space. I know, but very little. We could talk about that if we wanted. But.
Yeah, I would love to. So what I've heard you say so far is that you started with kind of an environmental awareness and trying to examine what were the root causes and structural causes of the ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. You went through the business for good space, the impact investing, social enterprise, but still wanted to go deeper into this examination of the economic system at the root and how do we organize the rules of the game. And you are pointing to the kind of disparity of funding between one ideology of neoliberal economics as we currently see expressed and how it's supported by institutions and think tanks, and on the other hand, a lot of other alternative ideas and theories and emergent spaces that don't necessarily have that funding. And fortunately now with one project, you've been able to kind of get behind and alongside groups and help to bridge some resources, albeit still modest relative to the size of the problem, of people in this kind of post-capitalist economics space. Do I have that approximately correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, always just trying to get at the roots of the issue structurally. And then there's many. Economics is one lens. Certainly there's certainly others. So I'm not,
Got it.
but that's been a primary focus. Governance. I've done a lot of work over the past couple of years building out our governance portfolio as well. But maybe can I give you a few examples of
Sure.
some of the structural pieces? Yeah, because it's. And I want to frame it in that it's not necessarily that it's differing groups of people and that some people are right or wrong. It's just there's some challenging contradictions inherent with the way that we structure the economy that we're going to have to grapple with one way or the other. And it's about not just going around it or bypassing it, but just how do you look at it very directly in the face. And some of them are more well-known or more obvious. Like, for example, let's start with the growth paradigm. You have an economic system predicated on infinite growth that's inherent in a lot of the financial system, interest rates, discounted cash flow. The purpose of capital is more capital, this kind of capital supremacy.
Right.
So, and that growth is inextricably linked to energy, material use, and waste, right? At least currently. And there's a lot of the green growth orientation is where how do you decouple that? And there's not that much evidence that that's really happening. I will plug, for example, along that thread, there's a whole inquiry into energy and materials and those pieces, and there's a few organizations that do that body of work really well. I'll point to a great resource is The Great Simplification from Nate Hagens as a podcast, and then other organizations also in the kind of polycrisis ecosystem. But so the growth paradigm, one obvious one. You can't continually grow the ecological basis. And, quite going back to part of the challenge too is it's not just a climate issue, it's an ecological issue. You're moving past multiple planetary thresholds. So the focus on carbon of course is one important metric, but it's a hyper focus on that is problematic. Another example of the economic system issues, which I think a lot of these groups, which are focused on economic asset classes that incorporate positive externalities or ecological value into consideration, like that's a very difficult thing. Structurally, one of the things that causes that is that things that provide a lot of value, especially subjective value, to lots of people in the future are very difficult to turn into a return on investment today. So solving the ecological crisis for folks 100 years, 1,000 years in the future, very difficult to make profitable right now. Causing that is exceedingly easy. It's very easy to make a profit on that and causing those issues. And so that is a big time gap and there's a big distribution gap. Capturing that value now for the thing that is widely distributed in the future is exceedingly difficult to do. Any coherent economic system that can't bridge that gap will, over time, just be inexorably self-terminating, right? It can't deal with those tensions of we need to think about future societies, we need to think about into consideration with our financial products, with our economic system today. And then a lot of these groups are stepping into that and saying, okay, well, let's use Web3 or let's use markets or things to try to approximate that. And some of that, and then you can get into a whole big conversation about the benefits and also the challenges and all that, and it'd be fun to explore.
Got it. Okay, so is there any more context setting for like the moment that we're in that would be helpful at this stage? Like, how do you experience where we are currently at in 2023 at kind of civilization scale? Because I know you think about it and feel it deeply.
Oh man, that one's so difficult to talk about publicly. It's because it's a spiritual practice. It's not, it's something that I can describe and I'll describe, but the challenge is it can't be, no matter what I say, people will create meaning around it and it's not going to be that. There's no way I can talk about that and have it be actually,
where
I'm coming from. So, but I'll try. My focus has been, as I said, on ecology, and we are actively doing our best to destroy the biosphere as much and as fast as possible. And where we are in that trajectory is difficult to ascertain. Of course, there's many other crises and issues in addition to ecology that are reinforcing and in relationship to. There's different terms by which people are describing that these days. There's polycrisis, metacrisis, great simplification. And I just integrate that very deeply. I try to focus on it look at it very directly. I think it's important for us to be very clear-eyed and specific about the nature of the challenge and the scale of the challenge. That's why, for example, in our conversation, I will always say we're not talking about the climate crisis, we're in an ecological crisis.
Right.
Because that's paradigmatically different. And it's important because the political economic response to a climate crisis is not the same political economic response to an ecological crisis. And people, when they allied those two things together, it causes a lot of challenges, not only in shared understanding, but also, okay, well, how are we not only going to respond to it, but what's the actual situation that we're in? And how do we have a coherent conversation about that? Where are we? How did we get here? What's likely and what's possible at every point?
Right.
Keep refreshing that. Where are we? Really? How did we get here? And being really honest with that and incorporating things that maybe we don't really like to talk about or don't want to be honest about ourselves or societies, but how did we get here? Where are some of these legacy structures that are still here that we'd like to pretend aren't, but that we're all still participating in? What's likely going to happen? I think we're likely going to go through a lot of crisis, a lot of potential collapse. We can talk more about that. There's also likely a lot of seeds. There's a lot of new frontiers. There's a lot of new visions. There's a lot of, that's the exciting part, is there's a lot of opportunity and so much untapped capability within people and nature, not only people, just nature to thrive and to come back and all these things like that. So it's just a lot of both. It's a lot of real challenge and heartbreak and death and sadness and a lot of love and beauty and intricacy and wisdom and simultaneously.
Nice. Thanks for going there with me. I mean, one thing I've always appreciated about being in space with you in our conversations is that you are willing to humbly sit with the can't necessarily have our cake and eat it too, that we have to actually just be honest with ourselves. And, the circles that we both are a part of, I think there's sometimes a tendency to be like, okay, we can just fix climate change and check it off as it's a problem that can just be binarily solved or, and I'd love to maybe go through a couple examples of that. You've already touched on it a bit with the growth paradigm.
Yeah.
But that we can somehow just electrify everything and that's going to fix it all. And that we will decouple economic growth from breaking through the limits of our operating limits of our planet. Just maybe help throw a little cold water in our faces of
Sure.
What are some of the practical realities of the situation?
Well, and I keep space that we might do those things, which is a question of, are we doing it currently, right? So you could say we might have nuclear fusion one day. We don't have it currently. Even if we did have it, it probably wouldn't be very well distributed because a lot of people today don't have energy, in the same way anyway. So there's a lot of real nuance in many of these different inquiries and the ways that people explore and talk about the future. Throwing cold water on it, I think there's broader macro frames, which can be challenging or problematic. And then there's more specific, getting into the details. Okay, yeah, but how would that actually work around a specific technology? Let's explore a little bit more of the macro. The broader macro one is the groups that are in the kind of green growth category because it's still that kind of cake and have it, you can have your cake and eat it too, and we can grow our way out of it. We need to keep doing more capitalism and science and technology, and that's the pathway to address these issues. And it really doesn't match the real energy and material use. So for example, are we replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy? So no, we're just using more and more of both. We're using more energy overall, right? So that in itself, right? Then there's a lot around materials, right? And not only are there enough materials, There's questions about if you were going to extract them, what are the egregious practices how are you doing that? What has mining done to a lot of these different countries in the past? Are you going to continue that same kind of colonization plus quasi-economic development that's very extractive to these communities under the guise of renewable energy and these kind of climate mandates? And then there's a lot of different factors which are difficult to ascertain. So even in that example, you can say, well, we don't have enough lithium, but there will be sodium batteries or something like that. And you have to create space for technological innovation. And there's a lot of space for that. But it's not, as an ideology, it's very, very problematic. We could talk, for example, too, this is maybe answering your question in a slightly different way. And maybe we should start with this before getting in. If we wanted to edit it, you can circle back to it. I don't know, you can do it. But so, for example, you can say, well, what is the worldview that's underlying a lot of what you're kind of trying to question as problematic? There's a book, there's a lot of books that get really good into analysis of worldviews. But there's one by this guy named David Ehrenfeld called The Arrogance of Humanism. And it was great because it's so quirky, because he's basically saying that the core ideology of pretty much everybody is humanism, which he defines as the belief that all problems are solvable by humans. And that's kind of the underlying assumption that folks are operating under. And that's actually not true based on like empirical reality. Like there are some problems that are just, they're not solvable in general, and they're certainly not solvable by humans, especially problems that we are actively causing. So you have to be really careful for that core step that people take, or that core assumption. And then when you get into spaces, especially very well-intentioned and important work around climate and ecology or social issues, the vast array, they generally move to solutions. How are we solving this problem? Rather, what I think is more healthy is saying, how are we responding to it? And how are we acknowledging where we are and the reality of the situation? And there may be solutions in some instances, and we can utilize those, but in all circumstances, how are we responding to this more so than how are we solving it?
And in a lot of that solutionism kind of context, I find there's also absent a justice conversation or lens. Maybe you can speak more to that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the justice kind of lens. I'll use a term here that is well known, but it's what we use internally at one project is JEDI, which is kind of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, a bit more broadly. But justice is a really important lens. And one thing that I'll share, there's a massive, massive topic. I'd love to explore that. One thing I'll share to try to provide one piece of insight there is historically, the groups and movements focused on environment and then focused on justice tended to both be separate and antagonistic to each other, right? Because the justice-oriented groups would say that the environmentalists were elitist, white, out of touch. This is a very privileged problem when people are facing the kinds of issues they're facing. And then the environmental folks would say, what good is justice and equity on a dead planet? Both of them are right.
Yeah, valid points.
Valid points. You can't bypass either. I think that's the key insight. And you have to go deep into both of them, and both are very difficult. And a lot of the progress that I have seen with groups, such as the Climate Justice Alliance, which is one of my favorite groups, that are very focused on the intersection of environment and justice. And so there's still some of that antagonism or some of that distance, but in general, many of those groups have understood that antagonism is not helpful, but also all these issues are inextricably linked. Going back to polycrises, you can't do this segmentation anymore. We can't say, I'm a this funder, or I'm a this funder, or I care about justice, or I care about environment. They're all inextricably connected. It's a problem. It's the everything problem. We're facing an everything problem. And so you're having to respond to that. And that can be very challenging, but that better describes the situation that we're in. In terms of, very briefly, the justice thread and the equity thread is so important. And bypassing that, something I've done, I've seen many, many communities, it's bypass that is where a lot of groups are struggling, they're breaking down. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand multiple sides of these perspectives, both from the Black radical feminists and the Black Marxists to the Ben Shapiros and the Coleman Hughes, and like really trying to spend a lot of time with that material. And it's very difficult. And it's the only thing I can say at this moment, unless we want to really get into that, is just you can't bypass it. You have to go straight into it. And
I guess part of going straight into it, without us going straight into it, is just that doing that work to understand where we came from, or how we got here. You mentioned this at the beginning of like tracing the understanding of how we got here is key to kind of analyzing the problem and asking the right questions for what comes next. And I fear that, and I'm certainly guilty of it, that this urgency we all feel to respond to the crises we see can fixate us only on the future without really understanding the past. And a lot of the past that we've been taught in Western education system is only one particular lens. I guess it's just kind of an emphasis on that part of not bypassing it, is to really understand our history.
It's so much more profound than that because it's so deeply at the level of worldview. So you're saying, kids are brought into a particular orientation on history or how we got here, things like that. But think about an MBA class. Think about what they're teaching about economics and finance. I went to an MBA. I experienced it as a form of ideological warfare. I was like, this is where they're indoctrinating people into economics and business and this. And not that they're bad people, but it's an ideology that then goes and gets implemented and has all of these negative impacts, even from well-intentioned people. And so, that impulse to step into it, I think it's really important to focus on that, because that impulse to step into it, what is that? Let's get really focused on the reactiveness rather than the responsiveness. It's fear and fear of death. They're saying, how do we fix this? That's the solutionism. There's a problem here. How do we fix this? It's a very deep psychological mechanism. The mind just does that. If there's a problem, how do I fix it? If I'm sick, how do I fix it? How do I get well? If I'm dying, how do I not die? Right? You can't get past that psychological mechanism. Of course, it's going to be there, but that's what drives a lot of that stepping in, that initial impulse. And not that impulse is wrong, but it puts you on the wrong trajectory because you're being reactive, not responsive, and then you're trying to fix something rather than respond to it.
Right. Yeah, and the one point I'd add to that as well, in terms of that response, that reflexiveness of response, is it often fits neatly within the incentive structure of economic capitalism.
Oh man, yeah.
It's like, I'm solving the world's problems, and it could also create $1 billion company, and like without that real honest examination of what's my incentive and why am I doing this?
Yeah. Well, it's everybody should read Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. Everybody should read The Value of a Whale, because it really points to how the response in the social change ecosystem more broadly is a market level response, generally. This is also one of the reasons I moved away from impact investment, even though I'm not against impact investment. It's an important step, but it's still always this orientation on how are we engaging in a kind of market fundamentalism, right? And capital supremacy. And it keeps drawing us back into that. And I'm very specifically saying, that's not my political project. That's not the things that I find most interesting and the things that I think we should support and invest in. The things I think are more interesting are actual responses to the ecological crisis, the poly crisis, and things that are more about relationships, the commons, ecology, subjective forms of value. That is so much more important in these times, and it's been so atrophied, and we are actively driving each other apart and breaking those ties. And so that to me is where to focus, and to look at even markets, or so can we go into that for a moment maybe?
Yeah, please. That's what I was going to ask you about next.
Okay.
So, perfect.
So let me contextualize this one a little bit. I'll try to explore markets in relationship to the economy. I'm going to be completely channeling Kate Rayworth here, or at least my interpretation of her, because the framework I'm going to use was from Donut Economics. The donut, of course, is focused both on social floors and planetary boundaries, but I'm pointing to a different framework in the book, which is the structure of an economy. And she very helpfully points to that the structure of economy is generally within 4 primary quadrants: be the market, the state, the household and communities, and the commons. Most people are stuck in the dialectic between the market and the state, capitalism versus socialism, right? The commons is not even a generally recognized or understood category of ecological value, even though it's the basis of the entire thing. Right. And then communities and care and the household, that's another thing just to be commodified by the market. So market fundamentalism, which defines is basically neoliberalism. Market fundamentalism would say all economic activity should be in that one quadrant. So it's then designed to extract from the state and say the state should just be an extension of the market. You should send your kids don't take care of the kids together, send them to daycare, send them to some way. Like, communities are best also handled by the market, right?
Yeah, like watching a child at home doesn't have economic GDP value.
Yeah.
Sending the kid to daycare does.
Yes, exactly. It's incentivizing economic activity, right? Puts everybody in individual boxes, individual home, breaks apart the communities, and says that everybody should just be paying for these services. So it's a market orientation, or the market usurping communities, care, and the household. And then the commons, commons don't exist, privatization, it's absolute, and there's many different forms of commons, right? There's ecological commons, knowledge commons, intellectual commons, cultural commons. That's all should be subservient to the market. So that's market fundamentalism. And then if you think about that, if you're saying, well, all those components of the economy exist, but we're kind of saying we're going to either ignore or screw several of them, you're going to end up with a very, very, very fragile and dysfunctional economy. And you could say, okay, well, how should it be structured? Should it be balanced across those 4 quadrants? Should it be we should abandon the market and the state and just focus on the commons? Like, you can get into, okay, what's the political project that emerges from this? All I would say is I don't choose to say the right balance of those. I would say, but you need to look at markets in context of those others. And those others have been severely atrophied and are actually more important. The commons are more important than the markets. Actually, in practice. And so unless you're anchoring from there, if you start from the entry point of markets for the commons, you're going to cause distortion. You have to start with the entry point of the commons, and then you could look at, okay, well, what are the incentive structures? How do we approach that? But if you still engage it from the perspective of capital supremacy, all we're trying to do here is to make money and commoditize, even well-intentioned, because that's the hardest, is when people engage in the bypass of thinking that, well, if we can link the way we make money to the impact, then isn't that scalable? Isn't that what we're trying to do here? And that's not wrong, but it's definitely not right.
So what I hear you saying implicitly is that the ecological crisis, which is predominantly can be viewed as a crisis of the commons, like in terms of the tissues of the planet literally tearing apart, is an invitation to rethink how much we're orienting in those 4 quadrants between government, state, markets, private enterprise, household and communities, and commons, to borrow from Kate Rayworth. It's an invitation to really focus more on that commons quadrant, at least as a starting point of how we
and communities
view it. And of course, communities and households.
The state's an interesting one, right? So we could take each one of those and say, okay, how do you strengthen and bolster each of those? And then what's the relationship to the state? One of the areas where, as I said before, is that sometimes we allied the political project, right? The political economy project to the climate crisis is not the same political economy project to an ecological crisis. A lot of people that are engaged in the climate crisis are still very statist in orientation. So their response is large. And that's not wrong. State is a huge, huge important actor, especially currently. But that's different than having a very focused statist orientation to the political economy project that we are exploring or supporting. Generally, we tend to not be quite as state-oriented, partly because of the poly crisis, Well, actually, for a few reasons. One is, and we can go into this, is that especially in the U.S., we no longer have a governing system with a financial arm. We have a financial system with a governing arm. And so the state is not a particularly reliable actor for a lot of these to actually address many of the global systemic, and they're just not set up for it. I mean, even the absolutely important work from the IRA and stuff like that, it's still very much green capitalism, renewable energy. It's not going to address the ecological crisis by any stretch, right? So not that
IRA being Inflation Reduction Act.
The Inflation Reduction Act, and the especially the U.S. And we could talk globally and what's happening within the global South, within Europe, around how they're responding and different responses. But it's just to say that when you're looking at the four quadrants, one of the reasons that we, for example, explore a lot around solidarity economy or mutual aid or new economy in that vein is somewhat in response to the polycrisis and saying, you know what, in these contexts, things like local food sovereignty, local manufacturing capabilities, regenerative agriculture, the commons. These are not just, well, these are nice to have, kind of small is beautiful. It's actually in response to the breakdown of the institutional capacities that the market and the state have been providing, that for a lot of people, they're not participating in. Billions of people generally not receiving value from that currently. And then many people who have been engaged in it and receiving some form of value are potentially going to be excluded, or those systems, those institutions are not going to be there. And so you have to face that very directly. And so the political economy response doesn't necessarily incorporate as much of a statist analysis. One of my absolute favorite groups on this front is the Institute for Social Ecology that was started by Murray Bookchin, who very focused on notions of communalism and libertarian municipalism, but this kind of very much focus on place-based, local, deliberative democracy, communities, and not like very clear distinctions between a statist orientation. And you see this a lot more from frontline groups and grassroots. That's more closer to the political project that they're actually engaged in.
Right. So I guess, summarizing all of this, you've evoked polycrisis as a term.
Yeah.
You've talked about market fundamentalism and, the frame really that what we're seeking to imagine is post-capitalism.
Yeah.
Can you add a little bit more definition to this?
Yeah, there's a specific definition and there's a more expansive one. Let's start with the specific one. Specific definition gets into what's the definition of capitalism. Well, it's the ism of capital, meaning the ideology of capital, right? And that the purpose of capital is more capital. That's the purpose of the economy. It's you make an investment, you get more money in return. That's the whole orienting principle. That's a pretty simple definition. So post-capitalism would be things where it's not engaged in capital supremacy. It's not saying that the purpose of money is more money. Purpose of money might be shared societal outcomes. It could be more well-being, more economic democracy, more ecological value, more civic participation. Right? That's where a lot of these different terms come from. There's Buenvivir, solidarity, well-being. They're trying to point to a different kind of teleological direction to the purpose of an economy, which is exactly what needs to be done. So, and then post-capitalism would be pointing to that alternative economic system. In our context, we are exploring specifically economic systems that are described as more ecological, equitable, and effective, right? Which is very difficult. And that's the edge of what we're exploring.
Ecological, equitable, and effective.
Yeah, in alignment with planetary thresholds, more equitable in its distribution of resources and ownership, not just resources, but actual ownership of the economy, and effective in how it coordinates and meets goals and challenges. Yeah. So those are the kinds of economies. And then in the space, in the broader field, there's a lot of these different terms. We can get into the specifics and the delineations and which ones we support or more and why. And there's a lot of debate. Is it post-growth or degrowth or donut or great inquiry? But for right now, just say that that's the more specific definition. The broader definition, if you look at, most people are using capitalism to refer to private property in the markets. You run into a lot of real challenges with private property, and that's just one of the core worldview assumptions that the vast majority of people are operating as like that's sacred cow, so to speak. There's a quote by Andreas Malm that I think is a very pithy description of our situation, which is that private property will cost us the earth. And I think that's generally pretty accurate because the notion of privatizing the commons, which has been actively happening, is one of the primary bases of what's causing the ecological crisis. And so private property and markets as a fundamentalist orientation, and going back to that quadrant of market fundamentalism, hyper-focus on private property and markets as a means of organizing society and economy, but also as a means of responding to issues that were caused by such economic system, things like that. And I don't think that'll work.
Okay, so at one project, you've been constructing a portfolio and helping to construct with your team a portfolio of projects in this space. So maybe, there's a few other things I want to ask you about, but what are some of you've pointed to some of the terminology around, I don't want to use the word solutions, but our response. What has you most excited, and what do you think are some areas that people should really be paying attention to?
Great question. There's so many areas, and it really depends on the lens, this kind of stepping stone that you want to take in. So let me think for a moment how to respond to that. One thing that I love about my work is you get to see just how much there's so many people, organizations that are holding hands or trying to hold hands and walk together and learning from each other. And it's hard to see. A lot of groups not very well resourced. They're not the folks that are, adjacent to the money or have the podcast. So you have to spend time really looking. But once you do, there's a lot there. So much.
They're not like the companies in the Inc. 500 or the flashy.
No.
Yeah.
It's look, let's mention the New Economy Coalition. Like they're one of the main groups in the U.S., or the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Like I could go on and on and on.
And we're putting links in the show notes for all of these. So keep mentioning any.
I love the work of Dark Matter Labs. I love the work of Polis on deliberative democracy. I love the work on Citizens Assemblies, group like Democracy Next. The Radical Exchange communities focusing on pluralism. We could go by geography, we could go by sector, we could go by global South representation versus global North. Like there's so many different groups. I think some of the primary threads, I do like this thread of you're kind of encapsulating it as currencies or asset classes. To me, it's how are you incorporating positive and negative externalities and values into the economic system. And unless we can do that, there's not really, it's kind of that full cost accounting. So I think groups that are on those edges are super important, but the details, the nuance there is super important. So really getting the signal to the noise. And there's a few groups that I think have that level of precision. I really love a lot of the work from groups like the Center for Economic Democracy in Boston. I mentioned the Climate Justice Alliance, grassroots international groups that are Thousand Currents groups that are these kind of intermediaries between a lot of the front-line groups. I think that's the most important work. And then you can get into, what are some of the specific kind of institutional capacities or that these groups are kind of exploring. So some of them might be more on the citizens' assemblies and deliberative practices. Some of them might be more in the participatory funding vehicles, doing things around participatory, not only grant making, but investments and investment products as well. There's a lot of untapped potential in the cooperative space, especially the real deep cooperative space, not just the kind of light touch, but the kind of work that I know you interviewed Derek Rizzo at Common Trust, like that kind of work of real shared ownership. I really hope more funders step into that. I think it's a really easy adjacent space that I'm not sure why they haven't stepped into, because anyone that cares about justice and equity and labor. It's really about, how do you just give more ownership to people?
Yeah, ownership and governance of assets. He articulated it very well in the interview with Derek Rezzo at Common Trust.
Yeah, and I've been a little confused why more progressive funders. There's certainly some. That's a more adjacent space. I'd love it for more. It also depends, your question also depends on where you're seeing promise from groups versus funders. I think there's a few places where I would love to see more funders focus on the connectivity between these groups, more funding for experimentation that's really radical in these post-capitalist space. One of my favorite things about my job is that when I speak to groups, I get to ask them the question of what's your more radical vision? And everybody has one, and they have beautiful visions, and they very rarely ever get to share it, because if they shared it, they probably wouldn't be able to get funding, or they'd probably get laughed at, or it's too far, it's too on the edges. And so one of my favorite things is let's just anchor out there and just give people space, and they'll step into it if they can.
I love that. What is your more radical vision, as a question from funders? What else do you observe in this philanthropy space and these kind of institutions around philanthropy?
What do I see in the space of philanthropy? I want to be really kind to it. So, because it can be very easy to criticize philanthropy and very cutting. And man, it's a hard space. And it's hard, and it's one of those jobs that's difficult, but no one cares that it's difficult because it's such a privileged job. But so it's kind of like go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
But so I have a lot of sympathy, and I also don't really focus as much on philanthropy as much as I focus on economics. Philanthropy is such a small portion of assets that ultimately it just doesn't have enough dry powder to do the things that it says. It doesn't have enough resources. So when we focus on resource mobilization, that's part of it. It's saying unless you're starting to expand beyond just high net worth individuals and foundations, that many of these more radical visions aren't really going to be supported. But I'll say a few things about philanthropy and try to be kind about it. One is structurally, the people with the money are not the people with the domain expertise. And part of the challenge is because they have money, they think they have some unique insight, or they think that the way that they made money is appropriate in all circumstances and in their social change efforts.
Right.
And so it can be very difficult to ascertain, here's what works in this circumstance, and we need to bring over it to here. Here's what works, but it's actually completely different context, and in some cases is very inappropriate and problematic.
Right.
That discernment can be very tricky. But because structurally the people with the money are not the people with the domain expertise, it really is actually about identifying those partners and those core groups and driving resources. But then you have to be really tricky, because there's also this very kind of, for lack of a better word, incestuous nature. It's a lot about who's adjacent to the funders. How do you get access? So there's a lot of work for the groups that maybe are not quite as, it doesn't mean you don't support the high profile groups, but you have to spend a lot of time really looking and building relationships in a different way. That's another big piece. I think the biggest challenge with it is just that the vast majority of it is focused on incrementalism, and that incrementalism is actually just a rationalization of the status quo. And so the money that we really need, not just the money, the resources that we really need for experimentation, for more radical vision, is actually very conservative and very risk averse, and structurally not only doesn't enable that, but takes up all the space and prevents those things from occurring. And I've spent a lot of time with other funders, and I love them, and they're all wonderful people. But I do, going back to that political project, I try to vocalize this, and I say, I don't actually feel that I'm engaged in the same political economy project as the vast majority of them. And it's not that their approach is wrong, but I do wish there was a little bit more exploration of a response to the circumstance, which is not just kind of more of the same and expecting different results. It just, to me, oftentimes lacks a real analysis, a real depth of, let's be honest about the circumstance. And I think another thing, now we are kind of harping on philanthropy, but I think another real challenge that I've experienced with philanthropy is that it operates on memes. It operates on memetics and intentions. And it's very easy to say things. It's very easy to put stuff on a website. And it's very easy to operate from good intentions. And intentions and memes don't matter at all. The only thing that matters are effects. And philanthropy is not very good at analyzing. In fact, people in general aren't very good at analyzing effects. They're good at thinking about their intentions and what they're trying to do. And intentions don't matter. The only thing that matters are effects. So over and over again, what is the effect? What is the effect? Right? Without that kind of analysis, it's not going to be very helpful as a tool.
Yeah. Well, thanks for all of that. I always enjoy your ideas and commentary on philanthropy. You and I, part of the context in which we met was in a I don't know, loose giving circle, philanthropic context and conversation that also somewhat culminated in the book Post-Capitalist Philanthropy by Al Norlada and Lynn Murphy. And so I'll give a shout out to that body of work. I do, before we go, want to ask you about Web3 and crypto. As you know, that's been one of the lenses of this interview series. What are you seeing in that space? And give me some of that skeptic Evan Steiner Web3 throwing the cold water on my ideals here.
I don't know enough to be a good skeptic or not.
Oh, come on.
Okay.
You've been a good skeptic.
Okay.
You've given me your skeptics.
Okay. I think it's a great inquiry. It's how I approach any space. You can approach psychedelics the same way. You can approach new economy, regenerative space. There's going to be 95% of noise, 1% clear signal, and then a few percent fuzzy, hard to detect.
Got it.
Right? And so when I look at that space, I try to say, okay, where's the substance here? What are the important projects that maybe they're not there quite yet, but that they can get there? What are ones that are engaged in a relatively similar political economy project that we are, and then are not just using those terms, but are actually reflecting that in the myriad of ways in terms of how they operate, in terms of how the things that they're actually doing. Does the philosophy match the practice? Maybe that's the way of saying it. Within the Web3 space, they're talking a lot, they're using a lot of memes. Does that narrative, does the philosophy actually match the practice and the effect of that? And are they engaged in the kind of prefigurative politics, meaning they're trying to embody this, maybe not being able to get there completely right now, but that you can see a pathway for that enabling? The vast majority of the space, I don't see that. I don't see that they are stepping into the real integration of philosophy and practice in a manner that kind of matches the rhetoric. Is that problematic? Yes. Is there anything that can be done to it? No, it happens in every single space that becomes popular or frenetic or whatever it is. So you have to kind of wait for it to phase out. I will say there's a few groups that I really see doing great work and support. So it's certainly not to be disparaging to the entire space.
What do you think about the many efforts that are emerging around representing nature through things like carbon markets? Because you talked about market fundamentalism, you talked about private ownership. Do you think that, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, et cetera, on the blockchain is just inherently a terrible idea? Or do you have any other kind of nuanced frames to speak to there?
One of my first jobs in the environmental space was like in the carbon markets back in the day. So I've seen iterations of that space, and then the emergence of red, and then red not being so great, and the different standards. And so it's just too early to say. With a lot of it, you really do need a lot of time. There's going to be a lot of fluff, and there's huge amounts of problems. And I don't need to rehash the problems of the carbon markets because a lot of people have done that. Obviously, the focus on carbon tunnel vision and fundamentalism as a broader political economy response is just radically insufficient. It's not going to address the issue. It's not addressing the ecological crisis. Is it that you shouldn't do it? No, you just shouldn't think that it's going to address the issue. that's a tool, and I think people recognize that, but there's so much resources going to that. Then there's a lot of real big questions. Okay, well, how do you actually incorporate social and ecological value into currencies or asset classes in a way that don't foundationally decontextualize, don't commodify, don't create speculative markets around? That's just really hard, especially not doing speculative markets, especially saying, okay, if you're going to try to capture ecological value, how does that capture over a really long period of time rather than just a really short period of time? Or how is that not just decontextualizing it from the people on the ground? Because you might be able to do something to protect and forest that really fuck over a lot of people in the process. You can't, going back to ecology and the social dimensions, you can't remove the social dimensions from that and not expect these kind of massive distortions. Or you just engage in, well, the kind of the ends justify the means kind of orientation, right? And so I think it's hugely problematic anytime that you're trying to commodify nature of any sort and put it in speculative markets. That's not to say that having means to create asset classes, currencies around ecology and the value, social and ecological value, is in itself inexorably problematic and doomed. No, absolutely not. It's just really difficult, and that the people who are approaching it now are generally the ones that with the resources and the capabilities probably to implement some of those projects are probably not the ones that are going to have that real grounded, values and understanding. And then that's not to be critical of even those people. I mean, everyone's trying to respond to the issues from the place of where they are.
Right.
Yeah.
And one more final question, because I know you have some context now around plant medicine, psychedelic space. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, it's a quirky space. I try to gently lend support while not being too directly engaged with it. I think it's having a moment. There's a lot of money kind of coming into it, but it's not necessarily the right kind of money. A lot of those models a lot of those businesses aren't going to work. So I think it's going to have a little bit of a boom and bust for a bit. I'm seeing a lot of challenges with groups that are trying to be values aligned, raise enough money to be able to, they end up kind of distorting their values to be able to align with some of the capital that is there. I think it's problematic. I think there's a lot of taking not only psychedelics, but plants in these cultures and decontextualizing them, and especially within psychedelics and understanding that it's part of a broader worldview and cosmology. It's inextricably linked with a culture and a place and songs and other plants besides psychedelics, and it's much, much broader. And that when you take something like that and decontextualize it, commodify that, and integrate it directly into capitalism, you're going to get a lot of real benefits, a lot of positive things, and a lot of real challenges. And I would say kind of, what folks are calling with the AI space, maybe we could bring that over into other spaces and just be like, hey guys, let's slow down and say, can we see if we can do this a little bit better? Can we see if we can resource it in a little bit better way, values aligned way? Can we not just extract from the communities that have been holding these teachers and these lineages? Can we not just go the route of yoga and take an ancient tradition and just integrate it into capitalism, which has some benefits and it goes everywhere and there's scale, but it really maybe loses some of the deeper heart of it. That's also really important to keep there.
Any final messages or reflections you'd like to share today?
I would just share that we're in a really peculiar time. And there's a lot of real psycho-spiritual work that comes with this. And that can be exhausting or daunting, and also just really rewarding, and exactly what to be doing right now. and not in a self-indulgent way, not in the I'm healing myself so I can heal the world kind of way, not the I'm going to this workshop so I can post on my Instagram kind of way, but in a real, like, yeah, how are we focused on our own healing? Just that. Not so that we can heal the planet. That can come. That's okay. That can emerge. But that's external to you.
Evan Steiner, thank you so much.
Oh, such a pleasure.
And I can't wait to post this on Instagram. Okay, what do you think of that conversation with Evan? I appreciate how he distinguishes between solutions and responses. You can learn more about One Project at oneproject.org. You might also be interested in the conversations we had with Derek Razzo from Purpose Foundation and Oren Slosberg from Commonweal. You can find links to those in the show notes, as well as links to all of the different projects and organizations that Evan referenced in the discussion. For more conversations like these, check out maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe. Let us know what you think, and join our community Discord to go deeper. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.